everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining our live webinar, What to Expect in 2017, Predictions for Identity and Security with Forrester Research and SecureAuth. Today we have Andras Cser, VP and Principal Analyst at Forrester Research, and Stephen Cox, Chief Security Architect at SecureAuth. Before we get started, let's review some housekeeping items. All attendee audio lines are muted. Please submit questions via the Q&A panel on the right at any time. Questions will be answered during Q&A at the end of the presentation. Slides and recording will be sent later this week. If you have any questions, please contact us at webinars@secureauth.com. And going to get us started will be Andras Cser.
Out some of the top trends shaping identity and access management in 2017. Okay, so basically the background, right, to identity and access management in 2017 is obviously going to be all around how you don't want to be on CNN headline news, how you want to avoid media attention, loss of goodwill, any kind of issues and really problems emanating from data being stolen, identities being stolen, fraud and identity theft being perpetrated, right? Really, security has shifted from a director or practitioner level or VP or even CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, or even CIO, IT kind of problem to more of a Chief Executive Officer, CEO problem, right? Heads will roll if you lose data, and a lot of times when you lose data, it's because you're not able to protect your data, and a lot of times that kind of highlights some deficiencies in how identities are managed and how access control policies are enforced. Obviously, data protection is a key concern, so we kind of see this all the time, and you know, basically the challenges are getting just more and more numerous, right, if you will. Mobile and IoT, Internet of Things, present absolutely new challenges. User-owned devices, BYOD, are absolutely here to stay. That's the norm of how we should think about security. Basically, as the perimeter is going away or is gone, and for some organizations, right, you cannot really give a laptop with a VPN to every contractor and employee. And identity has emerged as the new perimeter. So if you understand who has access to what and you're able to enforce those policies and decisions, it is your really responsive and reliable way of protecting data and information. And basically this means that on the identity management and identity governance side of things, you have to have holistic approaches for employee joiner, mover, leaver, periodic attestation, and self-service processes, right? So what happens when someone joins, how they get entitlements, when they move, how their entitlements change, when someone leaves the organization, how their entitlements are being taken away, and how they actually periodically review these processes, and how you allow users, both may they be employees, business partners, or consumers, self-service processes to take place, such as resetting their passwords, recovering their forgotten user IDs, and really requesting more entitlements or more access to information. And obviously, we also see a huge need for a unified treatment of not only applications rights. Application rights and entitlements have always been in the focus of attention of security and risk professionals, but also how you access data, endpoints, and network access control. So really a much more holistic and broader view of what identities actually control, basically to what you control actually access through identity. So having said this, some of the key highlights I'd like to talk about today include, basically some of the background of why identity and access management is important for business, some future requirements for identity access management, B2E, so employee-facing identity management requirements we hear about, B2B, business partner-facing identity access management requirements, B2C, i.e. customer, consumer-facing identity management requirements, IoT, Internet of Things or connected devices type of identity management, how you manage these devices, and talk about some of our predictions for 2017. So let's jump in. Clearly, digital transformation has been happening. This is something that every single organization that we talk to is talking about. They are trying to kind of transfer their products and services from a more analog and paper-based view to more digital, much more self-service oriented. And obviously, identity and access management plays a critical role in allowing this business transformation to occur. And really, the digital experience and how customers perceive security is sometimes kind of working against the security strength itself. So basically, it boils down to IT security professionals fighting against marketing or line of business folks saying that, hey, we need to secure our website, versus marketing people say, hey, we need to provide even a less secure but a more customer-friendly, less friction kind of website. Having said this, any kind of an identity access management portfolio must support profile and preference management. That is how you actually allow customization and really a customized view of digital assets that your employees or business partners or your customers work on or manage or possess and just work with day to day. Identity access management must protect privacy, so basically leaking information even within the organization is less and less acceptable. Aiding in protecting sensitive data, again, is a very important element, and BI process support is also something. So identity management kind of highlights a lot of the access patterns, who is accessing what information, both internally, the business partners, and externally. That information is absolutely critical and indispensable when you're going to do any kind of a data-informed or data-driven business transformation. Some of the future requirements, very much consumer-like user interfaces in identity management products, meaning today's workforces have become accustomed to really nice user interfaces on mobile phones, tablets, and really across desktops. So really very tech-heavy, very much technically oriented user interfaces will not cut in identity management. So the user interface version 2.0 for an IAM product looks very much like an iPhone or Android device, easy to use, really a pleasure to work with, and much less of a technically heavy kind of technical user-only interface. So business user friendliness is becoming a very important element. This is even true if you're talking about just pure B2E back office identity provisioning or access control management products. Those user interfaces for policy management also have to kind of keep up with this change. API security and availability for IAM services as an API. So basically being able to intercept calls and inject identity between a caller and a called entity, and also making identity access management services such as a token service or provisioning, deprovisioning, access request management as an API. This is a clear requirement of integration with any kind of cloud resources. Behavioral profiling built in, understanding normalcy behaviors, and then detecting any kind of anomalies from behaviors profiles that you can detect it is very important. This kind of replaces this rule writing approach. Multimodal, multi-target identity access management, so having identity products being available as a SaaS offering, so software as a service type of cloud-based offerings, and also on-premises form factors in terms of policy servers to support both cloud-based and on-premises workloads and business applications and data. So clearly think of it as a 2x2 matrix, on-prem and cloud-based SaaS IAM products and tools supporting business workloads both in the cloud and on-premises. Identity access management becoming more lightweight and using microservices. Again, this is all about really kind of making sure that you do not install anything that you do not use, being really confident that you're only using those components and services in an identity management product that you actually need, but not more, so that it basically reduces friction, reduces the security threat surfaces, obviously improves scalability and performance. And again, privacy and security must be built in. As a result of GDPR, we see a huge shift in terms of how IAM vendors are responding to this. Really, how the data is being stored in these products is going to have to be redesigned when GDPR kicks in 2018, and vendors are actually preparing for that shift. Getting a grip on cloud apps and cloud platforms, it's really not a, migrating to the cloud is not a question of if, but more of a how and when, and how do we secure it. So what the data you have and how sensitive your data is and where your data is very important. And obviously, detecting any kind of anomalies in accessing data is very important. So really, identity and access management helps you answer a lot of these questions out there. So it's definitely something that you really have to kind of get a good grip on. The employee-facing identity management requirements that we hear about is clearly all about encapsulating data with identity protected. So who owns the data, who has access to the data last, how they got access to that data, beyond just plain not so feature rich 80 groups or security groups or attribute values, but having a better understanding and a portable understanding of data, identity and identity data is how you can actually protect your data. So really getting a lot of depth, context, relationships, and activity-based views into data, and obviously understanding in a user account provisioning how users are related to one another and what they've been doing in the past is very important as well. So if someone has been requesting a ton of access in the past, which is completely out of line with their peer group or themselves, you can always ask the question, so why is this user needing suddenly so much access to all these applications, entitlements, and data? And that's definitely an important question. Federation is being built between on-prem and cloud user directories and user stores. Really understanding basically how you're able to transform and synchronize your data from an on-premises user store to a cloud user store is definitely an important kind of question that we need to figure out. Adaptive authorization or attribute-based access control, again, there's multiple names for this. Reducing certification burden. In other words, if you are using an application from your home office, say in the United States during normal business hours, you may be able to exercise 100% of your entitlements, maybe read and write your Salesforce database for customers. But if you are in a remote location using a brand new device in the middle of the night on a Saturday, you may only be able to use maybe 30, 40, or 50% of your entitlements. You may only be able to view that data but not write it, right? So that is definitely the next phase in identity and access management, really kind of runtime-based decisioning based on who has access to what. Obviously, applications will have to change moving forward to keep up with that. Recertification, role management, and governance are obviously the whole identity governance is an ultimate preemptive strike against data breaches. The fewer number of employees need and that have access to data, basically the lower the chances that data will be compromised. It's very simple. If hackers can target a number of data owners, then they'll be more successful finding a flaw with a security system or unpatched computer where they can gain access to sensitive data or move laterally from a lot more compromised computers. So definitely a huge question there. B2B, business to partners kind of identity and access management requirements. anytime you have a large supplier or partner ecosystem, you have to understand how your native organization and relationship management really plays in that game. Really understand the organizations you are in touch with and the employees of these organizations or contractors that do work on your systems, and really have that in the picture, allowing delegated administration, sponsorship for these partner employees to work on your resources. Identity as a service obviously will gain adoption in this space. Basically, most IDaaS vendors are offering some kind of federation hubs, so that if you have two clients and they want to access each other's systems, that's definitely the next frontier in identity management. Privileged identity management as a service to support IT administration outsourcers and infrastructure as a service providers is definitely a new requirement. Basically, anytime you are outsourcing your identity services and administration type of services, you want to allow your business partners and outsourcers to come into your organization and manage your sensitive and privileged computers, do root access to Linux machines or administrator access to Windows boxes, both on-prem as well as in the cloud. And again, custom and dynamic trust networks, we fully realize that business changes fast, and identity management really has to be able to follow and support that without needing a lot of customization and reconfiguration. Some of the customer-facing identity access management requirements are also interesting and really have changed quite a bit. Again, we're talking about organization and relationship management in this area as well. A lot of times, end-user consumers are being onboarded by partner organizations, and obviously your identity system needs to support that. B2C or consumer-facing identity management is not all about, registration, single sign-on, single sign-out, profile updates, security question and answers if you have those things, still updates, or two-factor authentication updates. But there's also a great component of profile management, so managing things like opt-ins and opt-outs of marketing emails, terms and conditions acceptance, and a lot of other much more marketing and business-related functionality than just using identity for security. Multi-factor authentication as a service, obviously we're seeing as account takeovers proliferate and the passwords are getting weaker and weaker, organizations are wanting to push, move towards more push notification from just sending one-time text messages, SMS text messages with one-time passwords to mobile phones, right? The SMS inbox and mobile phones can be taken over and be infected by malware versus a push notification that reaches the endpoint of mobile device is much harder to divert and really hijack. Continuous authentication based on behavioral biometrics. What this really means is basically authentication decisions changing from a one-time yes or no kind of decision to more of an ongoing kind of monitoring and decision-making process. In other words, if we log a user in on a customer-facing portal, that decision and granting that session to the user depends on how the user behaves. So if the user starts to behave erratically or in a fraudulent manner, then you may say that, hey, we're going to ratchet down and actually reduce the number of privileges or what you can do on the website, or even log the user out if they're doing suspicious things. So basically, this requires great communication, but again, it's a very effective way of limiting losses and being proactive in controlling fraudulent activity. Wearables for multi-factor authentication, clearly an opportunity for running mobile-first, mobile device-based applications where you have the notification of one-time passwords or tokens reaching the same mobile device. So the example is when you're trying to install a new mobile application, you are getting a one-time password to your inbox, email inbox, or you're getting a push notification to your mobile phone. What this results is if someone stole your mobile device and they got past the screen lock, they're going to get basically all those pieces of information on your stolen device. So the second factor authentication can be basically maybe a smartwatch or an EKG reader or a sports tracker or even a biometric sensor, right? So these are all possible ways for authentication. IAM for IoT requirements. Again, the biggest thing here is the massive scale. We definitely are going to see at least one, but maybe 2 orders of magnitude larger number of devices in IoT than what we've seen in the mobile space. So it's entirely not impossible to see hundreds of billions or even trillions of devices in the next 15 to 20 years here. So again, this massive scale will change the whole landscape of identity and access management for Internet of Things. Lifecycle authentication, biometrics, and API, you have to do all those things for devices, not only just for people, apps, but also for devices. And again, managing consent in IoT device environments is very important. This protects data and privacy, and this will also have to have a new model for authorization. So how IoT devices are being authorized, how UMA, user-managed access, is being used is going to be definitely the new kind of area of thinking here. Scale, again, huge number of devices, 50 to 100 billion IoT devices, and all these DDoS attacks, kind of that we've seen earlier, have absolutely demonstrated the fact that the IoT devices can and will be used for perpetrating attacks. So you have to manage the identities and access rights of these devices. Some predictions moving forward. IAM suites becoming much more loosely coupled than today, so much more plugin-based deployments, much more loosely coupled than what we've seen in the past. So no longer having to install gigabytes of software just to be able to get a minimal piece of maybe a password reset piece of functionality. You should be able to get by and get away with installing just much tinier pieces of IAM suites. Identity as a service will do provisioning, governance, attestation, not just single sign-on. So IDaaS, identity as a service, or IAM as a cloud offering will allow you to create, modify, and delete or deactivate users in both on-premises as well as cloud applications, review user access rights with managers or app-owned application owners, and really kind of move beyond, way beyond just single sign-on. B2C will spawn a new class of customer management services. It's not even just identity management or access control, but it's more along the lines of how you have a holistic and 360 view of a customer's identity across all your properties in terms of not just security information, but like I said, profile management attributes. Integrating fraud management with identity and access management and access control policy enforcement is absolutely key. You have to have a full scale and full spectrum and the whole kind of lineage, if you will, and pipeline as to how somebody comes in on your website, what their navigational patterns are. Basically, that represents a risk. Because the patterns are kind of too fast, then it's not a human being, but there may be a robot trying to scrape your website, all the way to authentication, trying to log in, maybe trying out hundreds or thousands of username password combinations, hijacking two-factor authentications, all the way to back-end transactional monitoring, right? When you're seeing some odd or even out-of-line fraudulent kind of transactions, and behavioral profiling again is going to take place everywhere, from access recertification, so kind of informing reviewers and approvers that, hey, this access that this user has been performing with these entitlements that you're trying to make a decision on has been completely out of line from other users' activities, or there's a kind of sudden surge of access requests by a certain user or a certain group of users, and really inject that information as a tool and aid to the decision-making process of attestation by reviewers. So again, that and also, like I said, adaptive authorization, making a call, to what level of entitlements you can use in an application, or adaptive authentication, behavioral biometric-based authentication, monitoring, your keystrokes, your mouse movements in an application, and really trying to get to a good understanding whether even the user provided their own username and password, but they may be interacting with the device in a completely different fashion from how this user ID has been in the past interacting with the same level of resources. So again, trying to move from the signature-based policy-based approaches in both access control policy enforcement as well as in user account provisioning will mean that we are defining behaviors, profiles, and then identifying and then kind of anomalies from those profiles. And the algorithms are definitely going to become a lot more reliable, lower false accept, false reject, equal error rates in this area. So with that, I'd like to conclude my part of today's presentation and hand it over to Stephen.
Thank you, Andras. Can you pass me the ball? So a lot of my personal predictions kind of echo what Andras has talked about in his part of the presentation. He's an extremely intelligent individual, and I'm very happy to be on the same page as him. So let me get started here. So, I'm predicting increasing consolidation among the security vendors, and especially in the identity space. And what it really comes down to is the fact that we just have too much to do. We don't have enough time as security practitioners or resources or budget to do it. So with modern security products, you have a lot of manual work you have to do in policy configuration. We aren't doing a great job as security vendors in giving you the best practices out of the box, in terms of options and workflows. You've got constant application changes to deal with, meaning lots of care and feeding to your security products going forward. And you may have complicated deployment options for many products. They may be integration heavy or endpoint based. So that's that can definitely weigh you down. And then on top of all that, once your products are deployed and configured, you're just getting too many alerts from them, right? And they're low fidelity alerts, meaning it's sort of too much to digest. So vendors need to be providing actionable alerts and not just, data. I always talk about this issue as being a very similar problem for fighter pilots. So, there's a reason that the heads-up display, the HUD, was developed for fighter pilots. If you look at the history around aviation, it was sort of designed to give the pilot what they need at any given time. So your SOC analysts are your fighter pilots, right? When they have information overload, it's going to lead towards ambivalence towards the noisy systems that are overloading them. So customers want products that solve multiple problems across multiple stages of the attack lifecycle and don't overload them. So a really good example of consolidation, and especially in the identity space, is the user and entity behavior analytics market, the UEBA market. So, this is a discussion we've had frequently within the SecureAuth, organization in the past few months and years is whether, UEBA is a standalone product or a feature of a product, right? You have lots of different security products that are incorporating behavior analytics today. In fact, there's some experts that are predicting that UEBA may actually disappear as a market segment, having been rolled into other products such as the SIM vendors. So I wanted to talk about identity becoming a pillar of security, and let me explain what I mean by that. But first, let me set the stage. Andras talked about this. You don't want to be an entry on a CNN headline, right? You don't have to look far in the media today to see that we are missing something. We live in a world with rapidly escalating cyber threats. The breaches are mounting, right? Target, Sony, OPM, Yahoo, the list goes on, and it's important to level set. This is my view of today's threat landscape. Attacker methods are constantly changing, and we aren't keeping up. And so there very, very clearly exists a problem today. Our current preventative measures are failing. Our existing protection capabilities are good, but the attackers are still getting through. And the truth is we're never going to fully stop an attack. There are humans on both sides. We're not just talking about malware. We're talking about real people, bad actors sitting behind a terminal. And this battlefield is asymmetric. So, all it takes is one user to be phished for an attacker to get a foothold in an environment. And many of these attackers today are simply using stolen credentials they've obtained from legitimate users or on the dark web. And they use those to gain access to your environment initially, or then, sort of pivot around and get into more critical parts of your environment once they're in. So we have this Everest-sized mountain of evidence that passwords are completely out of control, right? This is not the correct technology to protect us today. If you look at some of the, the breach reports, studies that have been out, like the Verizon DBIR, one of their data points was that 63% of breaches involve the use of stolen or known passwords. So that's 2 out of 3 breaches in their reports that used stolen credentials. So if there's low-hanging fruit in the security world, it's improving identity security. So let's step back to predictions. The future of security is about context. It's about using data gathered from multiple sources to paint a clearer and more complete picture of what's going on. So that means visibility becomes of the utmost importance. So the correlation we're doing today needs to be taken to the next level. We need to adopt orchestration. Orchestration and automation is gaining momentum in security, and you'll see a lot more of it in the next few security conferences. We need to do higher level analysis against those data points we're collecting, sort of illuminate all points in the attack lifecycle. So I mentioned the SIM vendors a little bit. The SIM gets a lot of bad press today, and in some cases maybe rightfully so, but the SIM is going to be vital to the future of security as a place to aggregate data and perform correlation or that higher level of analysis. So the future of SIM will benefit from automation, from baselining, from that behavior analytics, and combining these sources of information. And a vital source of information is quality data from a resource that we really haven't fully leveraged in the past, and that's identity. So identity is a security gap today for a lot of organizations. We focused on protecting the network perimeter, with network threat detection. We've started to adopt visibility into endpoints, but we're just not doing a good job of addressing the later phases of the attack lifecycle once the bad actors have abandoned the use of malware and they're using those stolen credentials that I talked about, to maintain persistence and blend in. So we have that network defense, we have that endpoint defense. It's a natural progression for us to simply follow the attack lifecycle and defend identity. So identity becomes a pillar of security. So I love this story. Before we move on, I want to talk a little bit about history for a second. I'm a bit of a history buff, so this sort of stuff always fascinates me. The man pictured here in the slide here is a guy named Professor Fernando J. Corbato. He was a professor for MIT in the MIT Computation Center. He had many contributions to computer science across languages, language development, operating systems, and security. But one thing that's interesting is he's largely considered the inventor, or at least the first known user of the computer password. He started using it in the early 1960s, where he was running a computing project at MIT. His researchers needed a way to sort of separate their accounts and their data out. So he came up with this idea of using sort of a secret key to direct the researchers to the correct location on the system. And this choice made perfect sense at the time, right? It was a small group of trusted researchers. It wasn't a large group of people. It was a small group of trusted people. So Professor Corbato is 90 years old today. This year he was actually interviewed by the Wall Street Journal back in 2014, and one of his choice quotes was that the password has become kind of a nightmare, right? He talks about how it's grown far beyond what was originally intended. So the inventor of the password is sending us an important message here, right? And we should listen to him. So, I am stating that we are experiencing the beginning of the end of the password. I'm seeing this in our customers and our prospects, and we have the data to back this statement up. IT decision makers are telling us that they want to stop using the password, and they're screening for a solution to this problem. So, security aside, passwords are also very expensive. I can guarantee that each and every one of you has been on a frantic call with IT at some point because you've been locked out of your account. So you've got to hire an IT staff to handle those calls. As your corporation gets bigger, this becomes a very difficult problem, and it doesn't really scale well. So one of the major advantages of centralizing your access control historically is that you can do what's called a self-service password reset. Andras talked about self-service a little bit. This is where the user does the work to sort of reset his or her password. But of course, eliminating the password is the next step, right? Both approaches are going to help reduce costs. So I mentioned the data that we sort of had data to back this up. We did a recent study with Wakefield, and IT decision makers told us that they understand the password is an issue and that they are going to try to do away with it within the next 5 years. So if you're not thinking about this, you should be. So I wanted to talk about the Yahoo breach a little bit. I kind of alluded to it earlier on in the presentation, but I do believe that it was an important and pivotal event in the history of information security, and I also think that it's a herald to entering the passwordless era. So I like to say it was sort of one of the big ones getting hit, right? How many people have signed up for Yahoo Mail, for Yahoo Fantasy Sports, or their other web properties over the year? So the latest reports show that 1 billion users may have been affected, and that stolen data included email addresses, included passwords, recovery account information, and other pieces of data. And this type of breach is a treasure trove for hackers and threat groups. In addition to adding to the dossier of information that they can use to socially engineer and phish, they also are invaluable because of the penchant of users to reuse passwords across websites and other properties. So, attackers will often try to obtain passwords across multiple sites to see where they hit, or they may even use them in a targeted attack, based on what they can glean from their recovery information or email addresses that that they've stolen within the data they've exfiltrated. So, we hear about breaches every day, but I really do think that this one was very impactful and has left a lasting impression. And I'm hearing that from our customers and prospects. They are very concerned. So I wanted to talk about a really interesting development towards the end of 2016, and I think that will remain an issue in 2017. And Andras, talked about this a little bit. It's distributed denial of service attacks or DDoS attacks. So taking a step back a little bit, we've gone and done a bad thing. We spent the last few years engineering these little secure Linux-based devices and connecting them to our home networks. Things like cameras, things like thermostats, smart television, smart remote systems, the list goes on and on. Garage door openers, there's everything's internet connected now, right? And these devices are being popped at an alarming rate, right? And as a result, they're getting turned into larger and more powerful botnets than we've ever seen before. Andras talked about how there may be billions, maybe even trillions of devices online within the next few decades. And if you study the tactics of advanced threat groups over the years, we know that these botnets are not just sort of, for spamming out data or for sending spam or serving up malware, but they're actually really used as generic infrastructure for attack purposes, in addition to being used for DDoS. So it really hit me this past Christmas that there's really no stopping this. We're down a road that there's no turning back from. Like, how do I ask my grandmother to remove malware from all of her IoT devices in her network? And the media really isn't reporting that DDoS attacks are often used as a diversionary tactic. We've seen this in breaches. One that I like to talk to is the TalkTalk breach over in the UK. The attackers actually tied up their security team with the DDoS while they exfiltrated the data, sort of out the back door, so to speak. So if you're being DDoSed, and you have valuable data, beware. And that's what I'm saying. So this has actually been long predicted. A very smart gentleman by the name of David Hobbs, who headed up security at the company Radware, wrote some interesting pieces on this back in 2014, and one of them was titled, "Is Your Home Network Haunted?" The other one was, I think, "The Rise of Sting Bots." So he talks very much about the rise of IoT devices being sucked into these botnets and used for attacks. So I highly suggest reading those. They're very interesting and eye-opening. Many other security experts have given their voice to this problem. If you follow Bruce Schneier, he talked about how it's going to get much worse before it gets better. In his words, it's going to all come crashing down. So those are tough words, but prescient ones from Mr. Schneier. And this is related to an identity. Many of the IoT vendors implemented poor security and setup around access control. So oftentimes, they use default admin passwords, or they're leaving backdoor accounts on the device for recovery purposes. So most IoT devices have some sort of web interface and a mobile app component, and none of these have incorporated strong access control techniques. So I do think that DDoS will continue to be an increasing issue in 2017 and the years ahead. So back to the passwordless discussion, I really do think it's time to think about and implement passwordless approaches. If you look back at the history of access control, we've come a long way. We of course started with the single-factor authentication, the password. I talked about that. Two-factor authentication has come along with many different flavors. You've had hardware-based tokens that produce one-time passwords. You've had the use of devices in terms of sending SMS text messages or push messages. If you've ever logged into the IRS website, you've seen a KDA or a knowledge-based answer as a second factor. And we've combined, biometrics with passwords, of course, over the years. But I do believe that the highest level of trust we can achieve today, and it also takes into account the impact to user experience, is passwordless. So passwordless involves a device, preferably using a push-to-accept type approach combined with a biometric such as your fingerprint. And on top of that, we apply risk analysis. So we analyze many different aspects of the authentication, the device attributes, the phone number, the IP address, the geolocation, to give you some examples, and look for signs of high-risk activity. One important note that I do really want to hammer in and reiterate is that about passwordless is that we can increase security without impacting user experience. So the user doesn't have to remember a password, almost always has their device with them, and the biometric experience is getting very user-friendly. We can tailor the workflow so that you can only be prompted to re-authenticate if the risk level is high enough. And how many security products can you say that about? More security, but unaffected or better user experience. So this is going to be great for verticals with what I like to call difficult and demanding stakeholders like healthcare. So with that, I will pass it back to Kayla so that we can take some questions.
Thank you, Andras and Stephen. We will now open it up for a live question and answer session. If your question is not answered, we will send you a follow-up shortly after the webinar. So one of the first questions we had is, can you elaborate some more on the topic of API security and availability of IAM services as an API?
I'll take this as Andras first, and then I'll let Stephen chime in. So basically, if you're looking at any kind of integration between an on-premises environment and a cloud-based environment, chances are that you'd have to be able to represent your identities in a cloud and for cloud-based apps like Salesforce or apps running in an infrastructure as a service kind of environment. The way you do that is basically you need to be able to represent authentication decisions, i.e. if the user may have already logged into a desktop or maybe NTLM or Kerberos or whatever it is, or just used a single sign-on capability, and be able to expose that interface where you can get these policy decisions, tokens as a service, right? That's one thing. The other thing is when you are, for example, have a calling application, maybe a web portal that needs to call a backend database, right? You have to somehow represent some credentials from that portal application server to the backend database. And how you do that is basically you can obviously hard code passwords in a properties or configuration file, but that's by far the most ineffective and insecure way of doing this. So identity services need to be able to actually provide a credential or provide a token that allows the calling application, in this case the customer-facing portal, to gain access to the database, gain access to another downstream application, and get data from there. So as that, and obviously there's a lot of areas where you have applications that actually do not provide any kind of identity management services to anything else other than their own user repositories. And if you're trying to kind of integrate your Active Directory or cloud-based directory or any LDAP or relational database user store with these services, then you'd also want to have some way of managing user identities in programmatic ways as well.
Our next question is, how can we store biometric information of the user? Do we need to store to Active Directory?
So I can take that one. So you don't necessarily have to store the biometric profile in a centralized directory. That's certainly been a method used in the past, but a lot of the newer biometric approaches keep the profile on device. So, you're either using it to unlock the device itself or to unlock a specific app or to release some sort of derived credential that you may present, to the server, to the back end for the actual authentication. So biometric profiles don't necessarily have to live, in a centralized directory, or leave the device they're being used on.
Great. And then the next one is, which products in the market support continuous authentication based on behavioral biometrics, specifically for an on-premise customer?
So, I can chime in and give a biased answer and say that SecureAuth IDP supports continuous authentication based on behavioral biometrics for on-premise customers. So yeah. We actually expose that functionality via our API, and that's actually deployed in our product today. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Andras.
No, I don't think so. There's other vendors out there as well. Happy to take inquiries on this. We also have a document on this as well, behavioral biometrics on the Forrester.com site. So happy to discuss this.
Great. And then the last question we'll do today is, why have different requirements for IAM and B2E versus B2C?
I'll take this, and then Stephen can chime in. So one of the underlying kind of base characteristics of the B2E, B2B, and B2C identity management is that a lot of times these user populations are completely distinct from one another. In some cases there are overlaps, but I think it's safe to say that for the most part, storing user information for customers is in a different place than storing employee or business partner-based facing information. And that is obviously the ownership of these user repositories is different. Typically the B2E and B2B repositories are owned by some IT or IT security organization internally. And in a lot of instances, the customer-facing identity management system user repositories are owned by marketing or the business line of business folks, right? That's one thing, ownership things. The other thing is that customer-facing identity management is very much like top-line responsibility. If your users cannot register, log in, reset their passwords, and so on, that is going to impact your bottom line very quickly, and the phones will start ringing really, really fast. Versus employee-based identity management is not necessarily always real-time, at least not the provisioning part. The single sign-on is more like a real-time and mission-critical requirement. So there's that, and then there's the scale, right? A lot of organizations may have 5,000 employees, but may have millions of users, 1, 2, 3 million users, and the performance and scalability requirements for customer-facing identity management are just way higher, and you have to do a lot more performance testing to understand the load, understand the response times, understand how you need to tune your system, and so on. So that's another requirement out there. And then I think finally the privacy is also something that the data and the regulations governing how an organization manages their employee data versus their customer data may be different from one another, although that's changing. But today it's definitely a different set of requirements there and legal frameworks.
Great. So thank you all for joining us for the live webinar, What to Expect in 2017 Predictions for Identity and Security. For any immediate questions, please email webinars@secureauth.com. And thank you all, and have a great day.